perfect alignment, perfect consistency. Impossible. 5 strangers watched a man die in broad daylight. 5 strangers described it the same way. Not similar, not close, identical, and that was the first sign something was wrong. At 9:14 a.m., Central Transit Station was operating exactly as it should. Concrete floors, steel beams, the low hum of commuters moving with quiet urgency. No one was looking at anyone for too long. No one was expecting anything unusual. Then he turned. He smiled, and seconds later he collapsed. The knife hit the tile with a sound that seemed too small for what had just happened. For a moment, the station didn't react. Paused, like the world needed a second to process the image before responding to it. Then the screaming started. Sirens arrived. Paramedics knelt. Officers pushed people back behind invisible lines of authority. The man was declared dead within minutes. 5 witnesses remained at the scene. They didn't try to leave. They didn't demand attention. They stood calmly, waiting to be spoken to. Cooperative. Composed. Too composed. Detective Mira Hale arrived 14 minutes after the first call. She stepped into the station without rushing. Dark coat, steady eyes. She had seen panic before. She had seen shock. She had seen hysteria. This wasn't that. She noticed the spacing first. The 5 witnesses had been positioned far apart during the incident. Different sight lines, different angles. No chance of whispering coordination. Good, she thought. Independent accounts. The interviews began. The first witness, a man in his 40s, sat beneath the single overhead light of the interview room. Matte gray walls, no windows, a recorder between them. "Tell me what happened," Mira said. He inhaled slowly. He turned. He smiled. Then it happened. Mira didn't react. "Go on." He stepped forward. There was a flash of movement. The knife entered below the rib. Clear, linear, unemotional. Trauma usually fractured memory. This was smooth. The second witness, a teacher in her early 30s, sat in the same chair an hour later. "Tell me what happened." Same inhale. He turned. He smiled. Then it happened. Mira looked up this time. The phrasing matched. The order matched. Even the pause between turned and smiled matched. Coincidence, she told herself, until the third witness repeated it. Then the fourth. Then the fifth. Different voices. Different faces. Same rhythm. He turned. A breath. He smiled. A breath. Then it happened. By evening, Mira had 5 transcripts spread across a long steel table. She read them side by side, underlined repeated phrases, circled identical descriptors. Even the filler words aligned. "I think. I remember clearly. I was standing near the column." But surveillance footage showed they were nowhere near the same column. She opened body camera recordings from the first responding officer. These were initial statements given before formal interviews. No time to rehearse. No time to compare stories. He turned. He smiled. Then it happened. Over and over. She slowed the audio to half speed. She stopped listening to the words. She listened to the breathing. Each witness inhaled at the same point in the sentence. Between turned and smiled. The pause measured just under a second. Not approximately. Precisely. People don't synchronize breath under stress. Not strangers. Not accidentally. Mira replayed the security footage from above the station floor. The 5 witnesses were scattered across the terminal. Different distances from the victim. No shared visual cue that could explain identical recall. They couldn't hear one another during the chaos. The screams had started immediately. There was no moment of shared storytelling, unless they weren't recalling anything at all. She called the third witness back into the room. "Were you frightened?" she asked. "Yes." His tone did not change. "Did you know the victim?" "No." Still no change. "Tell me what happened again." Without hesitation, he turned. He smiled. Then it happened. No searching for memory. No correction. No uncertainty. Like repetition had replaced recollection. Back in her office, she fed the transcripts into comparison software. The screen highlighted overlap in pale blue. 73% identical. In cases of public trauma, independent witness accounts typically matched less than 10%. 73% wasn't coincidence. It wasn't similarity. It was alignment. Her phone vibrated on the desk. Preliminary autopsy findings. Estimated time of death, 35 minutes before the emergency call. Mira stared at the report. 35 minutes before, which meant the man had been dead before anyone saw the knife, before anyone screamed, before 5 strangers described the same smile. The station stabbing had been witnessed by hundreds, but the death itself had not. Mira leaned back slowly in her chair. 5 people had given flawless testimony about something that could not have happened the way they described it. Their voices had matched. Their breathing had matched. Their memory had matched. Too perfectly. She closed the file and turned off the office light, leaving only the glow from the city outside her window. "They weren't remembering," she said quietly into the dark. "They were performing." And somewhere, in 5 separate homes across the city, 5 people slept peacefully, as if they had done exactly what they were supposed to do. Detective Mira Hale did not begin looking for conspiracy. She began looking for overlap. 5 witnesses, 5 identical statements. If they rehearsed it, they had to share something. She pulled their files one by one. Witness 1, accountant, divorced, suburban address. Witness 2, primary school teacher, lives downtown. Witness 3, rideshare driver, night shifts. Witness 4, emergency room nurse. Witness 5, graduate student in urban planning. Different incomes, different neighborhoods, different daily routines. No shared employer, no shared social media connections, no common phone contacts. Mira mapped their movements from the past 6 months. Nothing intersected. Statistically, 5 strangers agreeing this precisely under trauma should have disagreed on something small. But they hadn't. The only pattern wasn't in who they were. It was in how they spoke. She replayed the interviews again. He turned. Pause. He smiled. Pause. Then it happened. Not just identical words. Identical pacing. She ran a search not for relationships, but for registrations, workshops, classes, volunteer events, public programs, anything involving communication training. And there it was, 4 weeks before the transit station incident. Community Emergency Preparedness Workshop. All 5 names. Same date. Same location. Mira leaned back slowly. 5 strangers. Same workshop. She pulled the event description. Training citizens to respond clearly and effectively during public crises. Her jaw tightened. She requested the archived footage. The Civic Center room was ordinary. Folding chairs. Projector glow. Fluorescent lights humming overhead. Participants sat quietly, listening. At the front of the room stood a man addressing them calmly. But the camera angle was distant, his face partially obscured. Mira didn't zoom in. Not yet. She listened. He spoke about chaos, about how unreliable witness testimony could destroy justice. How you remember, he said, is just as important as what you remember. He began an exercise. Imagine you're standing in a crowded terminal. A man turns toward you. The participants watched him. Repeat after me. The room responded. He turned. Pause. He smiled. Pause. Then it happened. Again. He corrected them. Stay together. Match the rhythm. Breathe at the same time. They repeated the sequence until their voices aligned. Not louder, just synchronized. Mira slowed the footage. She watched their shoulders rise and fall in near unison. Inhale. Pause. Speak. He continued instructing. Alignment protects credibility. If you contradict each other, you weaken the truth. He had them practice describing movement with clarity, avoiding emotional language, removing personal interpretation. Focus on sequence. Deliver it clean. Mira overlaid the workshop audio with the station witness interviews. The rhythm matched. The pause matched. The breathing matched. The 5 witnesses hadn't coordinated at the station. They had inherited structure from this room. And then she heard it. One final repetition in the workshop. He turned. Pause. He smiled. Pause. Then it happened. The room repeated it perfectly. The instructor's voice softened. Good. That's alignment. Mira paused the video. The image froze on the instructor's face as he stepped slightly into clearer light. For the first time, his features were visible. Calm eyes, measured expression, faint, reassuring smile. Mira's breathing slowed. She knew that face. She had seen it hours earlier. On cold tile, under station lights. Still, the instructor wasn't just teaching recall. He wasn't just preaching alignment. He was the man who had collapsed in the transit station. The murder victim. Mira stared at the frozen frame. 5 witnesses, 1 workshop, 1 script, and a dead instructor who had trained them to tell it. The room felt smaller, because this wasn't coincidence. It wasn't panic. It wasn't spontaneous alignment. It was rehearsal, and someone had just staged the performance. By the time Detective Mira Hale reopened the files, she had already accepted one fact. The 5 witnesses had not panicked. They had performed. The question now was not how. It was why. People don't risk criminal charges for nothing. They don't synchronize testimony in a public investigation without incentive. There had to be leverage. Money was the most obvious place to start. Mira subpoenaed financial records. 5 accounts. 5 different banks. She looked for unusual deposits, transfers, anonymous payments, cash movements. There were none. No large sums. No quiet transactions before or after the station incident. No offshore irregularities. The witnesses had not been paid. She checked again, then a 3rd time. Nothing. If they weren't bribed, then they believed in what they were doing. That was worse. Mira brought in witness 2 for another conversation. You attended the workshop, she said calmly. Yes. You repeated a structured scenario. Yes. You later repeated it at the station. Silence. The woman's hands rested calmly on the table. We were told alignment protects truth, she said. Protects it from what? From being dismantled. The answer came too quickly, too certain. Not rehearsed this time. Convicted. Mira returned to the archives. 10 years ago, the harbor event. A waterfront celebration. Crowded, loud, public. Something violent happened. Panic followed. And when the investigation began, witnesses contradicted one another. Descriptions shifted. Timelines fractured. Details blurred. Defense attorneys dismantled the narrative piece by piece. The suspect walked free, not because there was no evidence, but because the witnesses could not align. Mira pulled the list of primary witnesses from that case. 5 names stood out. The same 5. Younger than, shaken, uncertain, emotional. She read their original statements. I think he was wearing dark clothing. No, maybe gray. I'm not sure. It happened so fast. The defense had torn them apart in court. Public opinion blamed them. The case became a symbol of unreliable memory. Mira leaned back slowly. The 5 witnesses had once watched justice collapse, and they had been blamed for it. She dug deeper. With a warrant, she accessed archived therapy records related to trauma counseling after the Harbor event. The notes were clinical, detached. Patient expresses guilt over inconsistent recall. Patient fears being responsible for acquittal. Reports recurring dreams of courtroom questioning. All 5 had attended therapy. All 5 had described the same lingering fear, that their imperfect memory had allowed a guilty man to walk free. Mira closed the files. They hadn't been paid. They hadn't been threatened. They had been carrying guilt for a decade. She pulled the old trial footage. The defendant stood expressionless as the verdict was read. Not guilty. The camera captured the 5 young witnesses in the gallery. Relief did not cross their faces. Only confusion. Only doubt. Mira froze the frame on the defendant's face. Then she opened the transit station autopsy file, placed the 2 images side by side. 10 years older, thinner, more worn, but unmistakable. The man who collapsed in the station, the workshop instructor, the comm teacher of alignment, was the same man who had been acquitted at Harbor. The same man the 5 witnesses once failed to convict. Mira's office felt colder. The workshop hadn't been random. The alignment hadn't been theoretical. It had been personal. The 5 witnesses hadn't been selected. They had volunteered. She reviewed the workshop registration forms. Each one signed individually. No external pressure. No recruitment campaign. Just 5 names, handwritten. The past had not disappeared. It had reorganized itself. She replayed the workshop footage again. The instructor speaking about unreliable memory, about how truth fails when witnesses disagree, about how justice requires alignment. He spoke gently, convincingly, as if he understood their guilt, as if he had lived inside it. He had offered them structure, certainty, a way to never fail again. And 4 weeks later, he staged his own death in front of them, gave them a scenario they could finally deliver flawlessly. Perfect testimony, perfectly aligned narrative. This time, there would be no contradictions, no courtroom dismantling, no public blame, only unity, only control. Mira stared at the 2 photographs on her desk. The acquitted defendant from 10 years ago, and the man on the station floor. They were the same. The 5 witnesses hadn't aligned to protect him. They had aligned to correct the past. The death at the station had not been random. It had been chosen, carefully, deliberately, voluntarily. Mira spoke softly into the empty room. They didn't rehearse for justice. She looked again at the old verdict footage. They rehearsed for redemption. And somewhere in the city, 5 people who once fractured under pressure had finally delivered a story that could not be dismantled. Because this time, they were aligned. By the time Detective Mira Hale received the finalized autopsy, the narrative was already forming in the public mind. 5 former witnesses, a man who once walked free, a staged alignment, public collapse. It looked like correction through vengeance. But paper does not care about narrative. Paper reports time. Time of death, 8:39 a.m. emergency call placed. 9:14 a.m. Mira read it twice. Then again. The victim had been dead for 35 minutes before anyone screamed. Before the knife clattered onto tile. Before 5 voices said, "He turned." He smiled. Then it happened. The stabbing at the station had not killed him. It had happened after he was already dead. Post-mortem. The word felt clinical, detached, but it shattered the entire assumption. There had been no live murder in that terminal. Only a body and a performance. Mira returned to the station footage. She slowed it frame by frame. The attack lasted seconds. A figure moved close. A blur of motion. The victim collapsed. But collapse is not the same as death. The medical examiner's notes were precise. Cause of death: cardiac failure related to advanced illness. No fatal wound. The stab wound was shallow, deliberate, placed carefully. A wound for appearance, not for outcome. Mira leaned back slowly. If the man had died naturally, and the stabbing occurred after, then the event at the station was not a spontaneous killing. It was staging. She pulled up the workshop footage again. The instructor speaking about alignment, about credibility, about how chaotic memory destroys truth. He had been terminally ill. That much was clear now from hospital records. Late-stage diagnosis, limited time, a man facing the end. And instead of disappearing quietly, he organized a public demonstration. He gathered 5 people who once failed to align. He gave them a structure. He rehearsed them. Then he died. And someone ensured the script was performed. Mira replayed the moment of collapse. The smile. It lingered half a second longer than fear should allow. There was no flinch before the knife. No reflexive defense. His body folded as if surrendering to gravity. Not fighting it. The timeline was becoming undeniable. He had died before the spectacle, which meant the spectacle was intentional. The public stabbing was not an act of violence. It was a message. She brought the 5 witnesses back in one by one. This time she did not accuse. She observed. "Did you touch him?" she asked witness 1. "No." "Did you see who did?" There was hesitation now. "We saw movement, not a person, not a killer. Movement." The script held. But beneath it, uncertainty flickered. They had been prepared to speak, not prepared to dissect. Mira realized something colder than revenge was at work. Revenge seeks punishment. This sought precision. She reconstructed the timeline. 8:39 a.m., cardiac event. Somewhere private, controlled. The body transported. Positioned in a crowded public space. 5 pre-trained witnesses already present. A staged motion. A knife introduced. Collapse that matched rehearsal. Police called. Statements delivered. Perfectly aligned. The 5 had not avenged a crime. They had executed a scenario. But why in public? Why not simply let him die quietly? Mira stood in the empty transit station after hours, staring at the vast concrete space. Because public events create records. Because public events create witnesses. Because public events create narrative. Whoever orchestrated this did not need to kill him. He was already dying. They needed something else. They needed testimony. Back in her office, Mira pinned 3 photographs to the board. The harbor courtroom from 10 years ago. The workshop room. The transit station floor. 3 spaces, all centered around the same man. In the courtroom, testimony fractured. In the workshop, testimony aligned. At the station, testimony executed flawlessly. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't murder. It was demonstration, a proof of concept, alignment under pressure, perfect recall, no contradictions. Mira felt the shift settle in her chest. The event at the station was never about ending a life. It was about proving a method. She replayed the workshop instructor's words. Consistency protects credibility. Alignment prevents collapse. He had not been correcting the past. He had been testing the future. The autopsy removed the last illusion. There had been no killer to catch, no weapon to trace, no crime in the way the public understood crime. There had only been design. The 5 witnesses were not accomplices to homicide. They were participants in a controlled narrative, and someone had orchestrated it. Someone who understood memory, understood guilt, understood spectacle. Mira looked at the aligned transcripts one more time. 5 strangers, 1 script, 1 dead instructor, and a public event that never required a victim, because the victim was already gone. She exhaled slowly. They didn't need a murder, she said quietly. They needed witnesses, and whoever designed it had just proven something terrifying. If you control the witnesses, you control the story. Detective Mira Hale stared at the board in her office. Harbor case, workshop, transit station, 3 events, 1 method, alignment. The instructor had believed in it. That much was clear. But belief doesn't fund venues. Belief doesn't rent civic centers. Belief doesn't build curriculum. Money does. She requested financial disclosures for the Community Emergency Preparedness Workshop. The Civic Center had been paid through a nonprofit grant. She pulled the name, the Alignment Project. The title felt too deliberate to be coincidence. She opened the organization's public filings. Mission statement: to promote structured recall, collective narrative stability, and cognitive integrity in high-stress public events. Collective narrative stability. The phrasing was clinical, intentional. The nonprofit had funded multiple small workshops across the city over the past decade. Pilot programs, research grants, public education initiatives. Alignment wasn't a one-off. It was a program. Mira scrolled further. Board of Directors, Advisory Committee, Founder. She paused. The name was familiar long before her mind allowed it to be. Dr. Elias Hale, retired cognitive psychologist, specialist in memory consolidation and recall accuracy under trauma. Her father. The room felt unnaturally quiet. Mira stared at the screen as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something else. They did not. The Alignment Project had been founded 12 years ago, 2 years before the Harbor trial, 2 years before 5 witnesses fractured under pressure. Her father had published papers criticizing chaotic testimony. He had argued publicly that justice collapses not from lack of evidence, but from inconsistent narrative. She remembered the debates, the news segments, the academic panels. She remembered watching from the back of lecture halls as he explained that memory could be trained, optimized, stabilized. She had been proud then. Now she felt something colder. She drove to the registered office address of the Alignment Project. The building was modest, clean, modern. Inside, framed articles lined the walls. Improving witness reliability. Reforming public recall systems. Photographs showed her father speaking at seminars. Calm, certain, convincing. A receptionist recognized her name immediately. "You're Dr. Hale's daughter," she said with a warm smile. Mira didn't return it. I need access to archived program materials. The receptionist hesitated only briefly. Of course, the archive room was bright. White shelves, clean binders, organized chronologically. Mira pulled workshop curriculum folders. Inside were structured scripts, sample crisis scenarios, breathing synchronization exercises, language simplification drills. She flipped through pages. The phrases were familiar. He turned. Pause. He smiled. Pause. Then it happened. Her hand froze on the paper. This wasn't just similar to the station script. It was identical. The phrasing had originated here, in her father's program. She drove to his house at dusk. The porch light was already on. Dr. Elias Hale opened the door before she knocked. He looked older than the photographs, thinner, slower, but his eyes were unchanged, observant, analytical. "You've been reading," he said calmly. Mira stepped inside without answering. His living room was lined with bookshelves and old recording equipment. Tape decks, microphones, labeled cassettes. He gestured toward a chair. She remained standing. "You funded the workshop," she said. "Yes." "You wrote the curriculum." "Yes." "You knew the instructor." A pause. "Yes." There was no defensiveness, no denial. "Did you know he was terminal?" she asked. Another pause. "Yes." The air felt heavy. "Did you know what he planned at the station?" Elias studied her. Define planned. Her jaw tightened. "He died before the stabbing." "I know." The calm in his voice made her skin prickle. "You knew." "I knew he wanted a demonstration." "A demonstration of what?" "Alignment under real conditions." Her breathing shifted. "You let it happen." He was dying, Mira. He wanted his life's work to mean something. And 5 people were used. They volunteered. The word echoed. Volunteered. Mira's mind returned to harbor, to fractured testimony, to public humiliation, to guilt. "They believed they were correcting the past," she said quietly. Elias tilted his head slightly. "They were." She stepped closer. "This wasn't justice." "No," he agreed softly. "It was proof." "Proof of what?" "That collective narrative can be stabilized. That contradiction can be eliminated. That truth can be protected from chaos." His tone was not proud. It was certain. Mira looked around the room again. The tape decks, the labeled boxes. She moved toward a shelf instinctively. Her name was written on one of the older cases. MH, age 8. Her hand hesitated before pressing play. The audio crackled softly. A younger version of her voice filled the room. Small, clear, careful. He turned. Pause. He smiled. Pause. Then it happened. Mira's breath caught. The tape continued. Again, her father's voice instructed gently. Match the rhythm. She listened as her childhood self repeated the sequence. Over and over, breathing in sync, pausing precisely, delivering cleanly. Her hands trembled slightly as she stopped the tape. "You practiced on me," she said. Elias did not flinch. "You were part of early research. I was a child." "You were gifted," he corrected softly. "You had exceptional recall stability." The room felt smaller. The workshop hadn't begun with Harbor. It hadn't begun with the 5 witnesses. It had begun much earlier, with her. She looked at her father for a long moment. "You didn't just train them," she said quietly. "You trained me." Elias met her gaze. "I gave you structure." She shook her head slowly. "You gave me alignment." The silence between them stretched thin. Mira stood very still. because the method she had been investigating, the system she had been unraveling, had shaped her long before she ever became a detective. And someone had designed it that way. Detective Mira Hale had already accepted that the station murder was staged. The man was dead before the stabbing. The witnesses were trained. The workshop was funded by her father. But something still didn't sit right. If the 5 witnesses performed the script, why did they believe it so completely? People can rehearse words. They can't fake conviction. So Mira went back to the workshop footage. Not to the instructor. To the room. She zoomed in, frame by frame, and that's when she saw it. Small adhesive pads behind 2 participants' ears. Thin wires hidden beneath collars. Easy to miss. Impossible to ignore. She pulled the workshop consent forms. Buried on page 4 was a line most people wouldn't read. Optional cognitive enhancement trial. Enhancement. She contacted a neurologist. Within hours, scans were reviewed. Subtle patterns appeared in the temporal lobe of all 5 witnesses. Nothing implanted, nothing surgical, but consistent signs of repeated neural stimulation. Like what? Mira asked. Low-frequency reinforcement, the neurologist said. Used in memory conditioning experiments. Conditioning. The word landed differently. The workshop hadn't just taught alignment. It had encouraged it biologically. The witnesses weren't just trained. They were stimulated. Their recall wasn't forced. It was strengthened. Mira brought them back in. This time she didn't accuse. She asked something simple. When you picture that morning, what do you see first? Witness 1 closed his eyes. He turned, he said automatically. Pause. He smiled. His voice faltered. I don't know if I saw that, he whispered. Witness 2 pressed her fingers to her temple. I've replayed it so many times, she said quietly. I don't know if I'm remembering the station or the workshop. The room changed. This wasn't confession. This was uncertainty. One by one, they said the same thing. They remembered saying the words. They remembered the pause. But they weren't sure if the memory started that way. The script had fused with the event. They didn't lie. They weren't sure what was original. Mira went to her father. You stimulated them, she said. It was safe, Elias replied calmly. You reinforced the sequence. I stabilized recall. You made the script stronger than the memory. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. If alignment prevents chaos, he said softly. Why is that wrong? Mira didn't answer. Because the witnesses were unraveling. Not because they were guilty. Because they were unsure. And uncertainty spreads. That night, a new video appears online. Anonymous upload. Different camera angle inside the station. Clearer than before. It shows the collapse. And it shows someone stepping forward with the blade. Not one of the 5 witnesses. Someone else. A real figure. A real motion. Mira leans closer. If the man was already dead, why stage a real stab? She freezes the frame. Enhances contrast. And then she sees it. In the reflection of a glass information panel behind the figure, there is another silhouette. Still, watching. She zooms further. Dark coat, low-tied hair, her posture, her stance. Mira. Her breathing stops. She checks the timestamp. 9:14 a.m. The emergency call time. Official records say she arrived at 9:28. 14 minutes later, but the reflection shows her there before the collapse, before the call, before the script. She rewinds, frame by frame. The reflection doesn't disappear. She knows she wasn't there. She remembers the drive, the sirens, the arrival, but memory can be reinforced. Memory can be shaped. She stares at her own reflected outline in the glass. The reflection didn't disappear. Mira stared at the screen, frame by frame. Pause. Zoom. Her silhouette remained in the glass panel behind the collapsing man. Dark coat, still posture, watching, but she had arrived 14 minutes later. She knew that. She remembered the drive, the sirens, the crowd parting as she stepped through. So why was she there before the emergency call? There were only two possibilities. Either the footage was altered, or her memory was. She needed something older, something untouched. She requested the full, raw archive from Harbor. 10 years ago, the case that started all of this. No trial edits, no commentary, just original footage. She pressed play. Crowd noise, panic, movement, one attacker, clear. She rewound, slowed it down. Still one attacker. There had never been a second suspect. The trial collapsed because witnesses disagreed on small details, not because the event was unclear. The doubt had been built from variance, and variance had been enough. She leaned back slowly. The problem at Harbor wasn't that memory failed. The problem was that memory didn't match. She opened her father's earliest research files, published before Harbor. Collective memory stabilization. His argument was simple. When witnesses contradict each other, truth weakens. When truth weakens, justice fails. His solution was also simple. Alignment, synchronized phrasing, structured recall, reduced deviation, prevent doubt before it forms. On paper, it looked protective. In practice, it required one thing. Everyone must say the same thing. She replayed Harbor trial footage. 5 adult witnesses, shaken, inconsistent. Then she saw herself, 8 years old, sitting beside her father. She had been at Harbor. She had seen the attacker. She found the child deposition. Her voice was small but steady. He didn't turn, the child said. He looked straight ahead. The adults had said he turned. That tiny difference fractured the timeline. Defense attorneys exploited it. If one witness says he turned and another says he didn't, who do you believe? Doubt spreads. Verdict: not guilty. Her breath slowed. The alignment program hadn't expanded after Harbor because the adults failed. It expanded because one voice didn't align. Her voice. She found the old tape again. Age 8. Her father guiding her. He turned. Pause. He smiled. Pause. Then it happened. Match the rhythm he instructed. But at Harbor, she hadn't matched it. She had corrected it. She had introduced variation. And variation breaks consensus. She went to her father before sunrise. No anger, just precision. You didn't build alignment because they failed, she said. You built it because I didn't. He didn't deny it. You were the variable, he said calmly. I was a child. You were accurate. You couldn't tolerate deviation. No, she said. I couldn't tolerate distortion. He met her eyes. The Harbor suspect was guilty. Yes, but he walked free because the narrative fractured. You wanted one version. I wanted stability. You wanted control. Silence. Then he said the thing that made the reflection make sense. The station event was a test. Her breathing slowed. A test of what? To see whether collective memory can override dissent. The words felt cold. The 5 witnesses weren't trained for revenge, he continued. They were trained to hold a unified account under pressure. And the dying instructor? He volunteered. Terminal illness. Limited time. He wanted his final act to contribute to research. The stabbing? A constructed narrative. She swallowed. And me? You were not trained in the current alignment model. I was the control. You were the variable, the reflection in the glass panel. Her presence before she remembered arriving. You placed me inside the narrative. I needed to see whether one dissenting voice could destabilize 5 aligned ones. That was the experiment. Not whether 5 people could agree, but whether one person could resist them. She understood now. The harbor lie wasn't the second suspect. It wasn't chaotic memory. It wasn't the staged stabbing. The original lie was believing memory belongs to individuals. Her father believed memory should belong to the group. If 5 align and 1 differs, the 5 become truth. The 1 becomes error. The station wasn't revenge. It wasn't correction. It was proof. 5 aligned witnesses. 1 dissenting detective. And now, she was the only one questioning the narrative. She returned to the archive room, watched Harbor again, watched the station again. 5 voices repeating a script. 1 child refusing rhythm. 1 adult still refusing. The system was elegant, terrifying, because if collective memory can overwrite dissent, then truth becomes a vote. She closed the laptop. The reflection in the station footage replayed in her mind. The lie wasn't the story they told, she said quietly. She paused. The lie was believing memory ever belonged to one person.